we speak about the abominations of the Canaanite people, the Egyptian people, and the Torah tells us, do not contaminate yourself as they have, because if you do, you will become contaminated. Those are the words of the Torah. Do not contaminate yourself with all this type of behavior, because if you do, you will become contaminated. What does that mean? It's obvious. If you're not don't contaminate yourself, so the result is contamination. So what does it mean? And you'll become contaminated. So he cites the Gemara. The Talmud says that if a person contaminates himself to a lesser degree on the terrestrial level, the effect will be to a greater degree. Or if he contaminates himself, you think it's limited to just this realm of existence. No, the contamination is something which carries beyond this existence. And if a person purifies himself, meaning he does something positive, a mitzvah, a good deed, whatever it may be, and he purifies himself here, they will see him in a positive light. He's purified above. You contaminate yourself below, you're contaminated above. You purify yourself below, you purified above. Very often, I always say, if not for the attribute of mercy, a person cannot survive. As it says at the beginning of creation, if God would have maintained the world in the context of the attribute of justice, because of its exactness, you couldn't survive. And if God wants an existence, since man is prone to fail, he had to give him many opportunities to make corrections. So therefore, that is the attribute of mercy. You made a mistake once, endless times, I'll give you many chances to make amends, to repent, or even if I will punish you, I'll punish you in small increments of punishment, because if I give you the full brunt of the punishment, you couldn't survive it. And if the objective of existence is for man to be the beneficiary, if you don't give man the chance, what's the point? So therefore, the world was created with the attribute of mercy. And therefore, until the last moment of a person's life, as the Rambam says, a person could have been evil all his life. Evil to the most extreme level. If the last moment of his life, he regrets all those evil acts, he's forgiven, the slate is wiped clean, and when he leaves this world, and he stands before the heavenly tribunal, there will be no mention of his evil behavior throughout his lifetime. That is to that degree, Hashem has actually put into the system the attribute of mercy. It's not a person that has to do tshuva all his life, even if the last moment, until the last moment, before he was able to breathe his last breath, he has in mind, and he says, I regret all my behavior. I wish I hadn't done it. All the debt is wiped out immediately. That's the attribute of mercy. To that degree, God wants one to succeed and to leave this world in a positive state rather than a negative state. But what happens if a person does not make amends in this world, does not correct the record, and he goes to the world to come? Then the person has to carry the full brunt of whatever he created. The debt, he has to deal with that debt. Mercy is in this world. The world to come, that's justice. God gives you a lifetime of mercy. You can make multiple mistakes. Of course, it's best not, but even if you did, God will create the best scenario for you to be able to leave this existence in a positive state rather than a negative state. But if one does not, you get the full brunt of that, what you created, the debt that you created. But when a person sins, but there's certain people that they're not deserving of mercy. They're not deserving of mercy because they're repeated offenders and they do it with malice. They do it with defiance. You never know. There are times God will bear down on that person and give him the full brunt. And people say it doesn't make sense. And if a person didn't keep the Shabbos, if he didn't keep kosher, if he didn't do this, didn't do that, why does he deserve such? And a person believes in reward and punishment. Other people look at it and they say, it doesn't make sense. For eating that small volume of non-kosher meat, why does he deserve a time in the Sanhedrin? If he was forewarned, he would get lashes. Lashes was 39 lashes. Or they would evaluate him to give him enough lashes that he wouldn't die under the whip. Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. The answer is, we have no understanding of why non-kosher is not kosher. We know it's not kosher because God says it's not kosher. But why it has that negative effect on our spirituality. It actually compromises our spirituality. If a person, God forbid, has cancer, and the doctor says the person needs very serious chemo, to the point where literally he wrenches his gut out, and he suffers, and he becomes emaciated, and he has his immune system begins failing, and it's compromised. They said it doesn't make sense, because the person has a microscopic cell of cancer. It's like taking a blowtorch and putting it on the person. You're totally incinerating the person. So the doctor says, you don't understand. If we succeed with this procedure and we destroy that cancer cell that it can't fester, the person is going to be able to live later. It's going to be able to live on. So he said, but why does that be so serious? Why can't he just take a pill? Person has a migraine. You take that aspirin or that whatever it may be, and you resolve it. Why can't it be? So the doctor says, because if you'd only understand the nature of the disease, the only way we can arrest this disease and destroy it is only by, this is the only protocol. If we would understand the innate nature of what we generate when we sin, we'd understand the lethal characteristic of what that sin is. So when you contaminate yourself here, what does it mean? What did I do? I didn't keep the Shabbos. I did this, I did that. We minimize it. We only minimize it because we don't appreciate exactly what we're doing. But in heaven, what we call it in Shamayim, when you contaminate yourself there it manifests itself in its full magnified reality. It's only when you come there, only then do you understand what you created. But here you don't understand. So if a person would understand the ramifications of his negative behavior, it would be what? He'd definitely refrain and restrain himself, understanding the consequence. I always give the example, Rav Chaim writes that the Amidah was authored by the men of the High Assembly, right after the rebuilding of the Second Temple. And the Talmud says there were a number of prophets among them. The last three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they were last three, because there was no prophecy during the Second Temple period. They were among this body of great Torah sages who authored the Amidah. So Chaim asks, why did you need prophets? Torah sages we understand, because they understand exactly how one has to supplicate God. Choice of words, but what do we need prophets? So he explains that the text of the Amidah, which is written in Hebrew, which is God's language, and that's why it's called the Holy Tongue, those words that were chosen, only a prophet understands all the inner workings of the spiritual worlds, of the spiritual realm. They had to choose certain words that, although we don't understand the ramifications of that word, by saying that word, it activates forces, positive forces, which bring about very positive results, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's blessing, whatever it may be, whether it's the world achieving more perfect state. We don't understand the ramifications of those words. And Reb Chaim writes, therefore, if a person says the word, although he doesn't understand, he doesn't have any inkling of the ramifications of that word, but you understand, you're standing before God, and just understand what the word means at the most simple level. You activate those forces, because in that word innately lies the power to activate that force. So the example I give, a person sits at a keyboard, and this keyboard, you have trident missiles under the ocean in various locations or silos throughout the world. And a person doesn't know what he's doing, and he just starts pressing these buttons. And he doesn't realize every time he hits a key, He activates a missile. And that missile, God forbid, is aimed at a certain city and 10 million people are destroyed. He doesn't even understand what's happening. And the person innocently just keeps pressing the buttons. Those buttons could destroy the world. Because what you're activating are such negative forces which bring about the ultimate level of destruction. Identically, in the positive, when you say those words, as long as you understand you're in the presence of God and you have that sense of humility and you realize you're supplicating, and you understand that word at the most simple level, God, you endow man with wisdom, with insight, with understanding. Endow me with that. Just those words, you don't say more than that. What does it mean? It means a lot more than what we think it means. Endlessly more. It's the same thing when you put the penny, even a penny in the charity box, and you have in mind, I'm doing it to give charity, what that activates in the positive, it's not to be fathomed. Because we have no understanding or relevance to understanding the spiritual worlds. And therefore we don't understand its ramifications. But it does have. And the more you infuse it with a positive intent, the greater it's its force. You know, what's interesting, we just read at the end of the book of Bereshis that Yaakov, he blesses Yosef, which is his most special son, and he designates his two sons, although they were his grandchildren, as tribes. He says Ephraim and Manasseh should be the equivalent of Reuven and Shimon among the tribes of Israel. Then he says, and I will give you an additional portion, which I took from the Amori, from the Morites, the Kashti v'charbi, with my bow and with my sword. That's what he says. So the Aramaic translation of the word Kashti, in Hebrew, Kashti means with my bow and with my sword. I took that portion from the Amorites with my bow and my sword. That I will give to you as a gift. An additional gift other than what your brothers have. So Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk explains what does it mean. So the Aramaic translation is Bekashti, with my supplication, with my voluntary supplication. The Charbi, with my sword, with my compulsory supplication. With my voluntary supplication, with my compulsory obligation. Which I had no choice, I had to pray. So he goes to explain the law is a person feels his mind is distracted, but he could maintain a minimal level of focus. He says the Amida, although his mind is wandering when he's saying it, he says Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv, you have no choice. You're obligated to say pray 3 times a day, stand in presence of God and supplicate him. That's your obligation. Because it's an obligation, even though the focus and the intent is far from where it should be, it has value. Has value. What about if a person says the 3 prayers and he wants to add a 4th one? Because he remembered he has a special personal request. You only could offer the voluntary supplication if you're guaranteed that you can be focused and not be distracted from the first word till the last word. If you don't have that sense of confidence you can make it through, you're not permitted to pray that 4th prayer. The first 3 you can, because that's an obligation. The 4th or the 5th, whatever you want to add, which is voluntary, you have to be assured in your own mind that you're able to focus and not be distracted from the beginning till the end. So he explains, Rameir Simcha of Dvinsk, an archer, a person who shoots an arrow, the bowsman, how far does the arrow fly? It's based on to what degree you pull that bow. The more power you put behind that arrow, the farther that arrow flies. What about in the old days, what was a sword? A sword wasn't a fencing sword. A sword had weight. It was a piece of iron or bronze, which was sharp. And when you would hit your opponent, why was he killed by it or seriously injured? It was because the weight of the force of that blade. So it has weight. So that's what Yaakov says. I took the portion of the Amorites with my bow and my sword, with my voluntary supplication, which is the bow. That's based on how much power you put behind that arrow. That's to what degree the arrow flies. And with my supplication, which is obligatory, that's the equivalent of the sword. It cuts based on its own weight. You just put it down because of the weight of the sword. It will cut. It will bring back some level of result, even if you don't put force behind that blade. So therefore, that's what it's about. So when a person does a mitzvah, it depends what do we infuse the mitzvah with. A person does it with a self-interest, for ulterior motives. It has value no matter what, because the mitzvah carries its own weight. But if you infuse it with that special intent, then it brings about a greater result. If you do it, God forbid, not with a negative intent, not with ulterior motive, because you want to actually embarrass another person, to show somebody you're better than the other person, then God says, you know something, that kind of mitzvah I'm not interested in. Not interested whatsoever. But it's identically the same thing with a sin. Person sins inadvertently, doesn't even realize he's sinning. It has a negative, like a person eats something which is tainted. Person gets sick. It'll affect you negatively. What about if a person goes and he deliberately violates and transgresses? It has a greater negative effect. What about a person violates defiantly? That means the sin is infused with even a more negative intent. It compromises even to a greater degree. But why? Defiant, you say, the main thing is because you're defiant against God. But if it's deliberate because I desire it, is it so terrible that I satisfy my temptation? Is it so terrible? You don't realize what it is. That itself, it's like not understanding how lethal something is, because in the physical realm, we have no way to evaluate what exactly is the negativity of that particular action, or how positive something is. Why is something more important than something else, has greater value in the positive? Because God says God grades it. He classifies it. That's what it's all about. So again, the Chafetz Chaim says, in terms of our behavior, sometimes we mentioned in the name of the Zohar that a person does chesed, does act of kindness, and it's special. God says, my children who need chesed, look at the chesed they're doing. And I control chesed, I'm the creator. I shouldn't do chesed. If my children do chesed, I shouldn't do chesed. So that person who does that special act of kindness, you know what God says? All the kindness that will be extended to the world today is the merit of that person. Because he activated that force which causes God to shower kindness, chesed, on the whole world. You know what that means? So you never know. A person goes out of his way to help a person who's truly in need. And he's sensitive to that. With nobody else, everybody glosses over that person. And this one person is sensitive and addresses his need. What is the value of that action? You know what that means? Do you know it means that every beneficiary of kindness in the whole world, you have 8.5 billion people. Everyone is a recipient of God's kindness. God says today, he's the benefactor of the day. This one individual, you can't compute it. That's how great. It's not only because you can't compute just even the one action, even at a minimal level. This is global. The person that could one person sustain a whole world? How do you sustain a whole world? Only God could. You helped this one individual, but that one individual activated a level of sustenance that the whole world was sustained. We had mentioned, name of Chaim Volozhina, that the Mishnah says that there's a baskol, there's a heavenly voice that comes out from Sinai every day that says, Kol olam kula nizan b'shul chanina b'di. The whole world is sustained in the merit of Rav Chanina ben Dosa. Rav Chanina ben Dosa was a very, very holy, special man. Why is the world sustained, and who is he? How do we quantify him? Shedai lo b'kav charubim me'erev Shabbos erev Shabbos. That he only has a small measure of carob. That's his whole sustenance. From erev Shabbos to erev Shabbos in a week, and it's sufficient. It's sufficient. Dailo. In his merit, the whole world is sustained. I mean, how does a man have that level of worthiness? Evidently, in his own specialness, in his quality of service of God, that was enough to activate forces to sustain a whole world. So Chaim Volozhin says, we read in Pirkei Avos, the world stands on three principles. Torah, the study of Torah, Avod, the service of God, and Gemilas Chasodim, and doing acts of living kindness. Says the man doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together. How does he do kindness? Say he's a nice man, he helps people. He'll help the old lady across the street, right? But a true philanthropist. How could he be a true philanthropist? So Rav Chaim Volozhin says In the history of the world, there was no philanthropist like Rab Hanina Mendoza. Every day there's a heavenly voice says, in his merit, the whole world is sustained. It's like, the billionaire writes that $100 million check. But who put money in the account behind that check? Rab Hanina Mendoza, who doesn't have two nickels to rub together, he put money in the account so that he could draw that check, has value. So who is the greatest Gomer Chesed, the one who does acts of loving kindness? Rab Hanina Mendoza, he's top of the list because of that. So the way we evaluate things, the way we understand things, well, he looks like a what we call a pitiful creature, because he goes with threadbare clothing and whatever else may be. You don't understand this man. This man is a giant. Remember, many years ago, my father-in-law and his mother, they were born in St. Louis. And they came over in the 1880s from Kovna. And in those days, they had Jews where they spoke with a Midwest accent, but when they spoke Yiddish, they spoke with a real Lithuanian Yiddish. And they weren't necessarily all observant Jews. So there was a Jew, his name was Mr. Kaplan. And he was in the building supply business. I'm talking about this in the 50s. He was a multimillionaire. He drove a pickup truck. He spoke and he looked like a cowboy because he wore leather clothing. You'll have wealth, you'll have fame, and you will have children. And then he says, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So the order of the pasuk of the verse seems to be, there's a change between, he speaks, I will bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. When it speaks about blessing, he says, vorchecha avorech. Those who bless you, I will bless. Vorchecha, I will bless. So our Chaim HaKadosh explains, God says that those who will bless you in the future, who haven't yet blessed you, they will already be blessed even before they bless you. So he says, why? So he explains, you have two people. One person is a special person, a holy man. The other person is an okay person. And they both offer the same blessing with sincerity. Whose blessing has greater value? The person who's the holier person. His blessing has greater value. So God says, since he wants Avram Avinu, Abraham, to be the greatest beneficiary of the blessing, he says, I will bless those who will bless you in the future even before they bless you. So when they bless you, you should be a greater beneficiary of the blessing. That's how our Chaim HaKadosh explains it. Those who will bless you in the future, they haven't blessed you yet. So they're not yet deserving of the blessing. But I will pre-bless them even before they bless you. So when they bless you, you should be a greater beneficiary of the blessing. Because now they're more special people. We read regarding the midwives in Egypt, Yocheved and Miriam, who were known as Shifra and Puah. They defied the order of the king to kill the male children. And they did not kill them, not only they sustained them. So the Torah tells us that God rewarded them by giving them special families. Special families. Yocheved, Kohanim and Levim come from Yocheved, and the royalty comes from Miriam because of what they did. Now, what was the most special family other than Yaakov and his children in the history of Jewish people? Yocheved and Aaron had most special children. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Could you imagine? One family, a couple has Moshe, where the Torah tells us he was the equivalent of the whole Jewish people. Aaron, his brother, was the high priest, was the equivalent of he was. Miriam was special. Why did they merit special children? The answer is because if not for them, the Chaim HaKadosh explains there would not be a Jewish people. If they would have buckled and heeded the decree of the king, there would be no Jewish people if they would have killed the males. So why is there a Jewish people? Because Yocheved, it says, they feared God. Because the fear of God, that's what is a Jewish people. So therefore, measure for measure, as because of your sacrifice and your reverence for God, there's a Jewish people, you will have children who will be the equivalent of the Jewish people. That's the Or Chaim HaKadosh. That's why they had the most special family. So, if you read the pasuk, the verse, it says, God did good for the midwives, the nation increased and proliferated, and he made for them families. So if you read the verse as it reads, it seems to be it's a little bit of a digression. It says he did good for them. He gave them special families. Then it should say, and the nation continued to thrive and proliferate and so on and so forth. No, the Torah is telling us what was the goodness and the gift that he gave to them. He allowed the Jews to thrive because a ramification of their sacrifice and their reverence was that Jews have proliferated. That's why they merited those special homes. Let's say two people do an action. One person does an action, turns the world upside down. The other person does an action, same thing, limited of value. Who has greater return on his mitzvah? The one who, I'll give you an example. I always speak about the professed atheist, and I get a call from him, and there's a person who's close with me who's also a philanthropist. They're both philanthropists, and this person says to me that why doesn't this person want to contribute and participate in a certain, I once mentioned this, but I'll bring out a different point, in my project. But what bothers him, and I explained it to him, he gives away mega dollars, mega amounts of money. This professed atheist, he's a good person, he's a philanthropist, he wants to do the right thing. Except unfortunately, he doesn't have the proper belief. Okay? The other person is an observant person. This other person who's the observant person also gives tens and tens of billions of dollars to charity, hundreds over the years, and whatever he does succeeds. Always succeeds. And the other person, with the mega dollars that he puts in, doesn't succeed. And it bothers him. It really bothers him. Why does the other guy succeed as a philanthropist, and him, it fizzles out after 3-4 years, it's over. So, could you explain it? You could explain it, but it has to be able to resonate to the person. They're both people, and they're both doing good things. Good things. But the question is, what are ramifications of one person, what are the ramifications of the other person? Different ramification. If a ramification has greater ramification, the return is a different return. The others, very limited, very limited. I'll give you an example. He once purchased a piece of property on the west side, and he called it the Cave. It was called the Cave. What was it about? That Jewish boys and girls should meet. It was a coffee house. Socialize. That ultimately Jewish boys and girls should marry. They should not assimilate. That's what it is. Paid a fortune for the property and for the setting it up and creating it with the advertising. Within 3 years, it was out of business. He gave it away. He gave it away to the Federation. It failed. So I asked him that. I said, your intent is great. You don't want Jews to assimilate. But I said, what happens if a Jewish boy wants to bring his non-Jewish girlfriend to the cave? You're not going to let him in with his non-Jewish girlfriend. He says, I didn't think about that. But again, it's something which is so, the intent is great and pure, and you mean well. But you understand, that's not where you put your dollars. You got to put your dollars in something greater. And not only that, it has to be infused with a belief. It's not cultural. It's because of my identity. I don't want my identity to just evaporate. There should be a representation of Jews. It's much more than that. We're God's people. We're connected. And if you do it because you're connected, it's a whole different connect. It's a different level of viability and quality in the action itself. That's the difference. So therefore, a person sins on the terrestrial level. The sin has its mark on the celestial level, on the spiritual level. You do a mitzvah on the terrestrial level, it has ramifications to the other level also. My Rosh Hashiva, blessed memory, used to say, the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, it uses a term that there is a din v'cheshbon. There's a judgment and there's a computation. So there's a question, and there's the question that Vilna Gaon asks. It should say computation and then judgment. First, you actually evaluate the record, and then afterwards, there's a judgment. So the Vilna Gaon gives his answer, which we once discussed. Our Shiva used to say this, explained it this way. Person in his lifetime, he does great things on a personal level. But let's say he did something which he influenced the person negatively. And the person he influenced negatively has many years to live. And he has many years to sin. So when the person dies who created this negative influence, he can't be punished for the negative influence and all the ramifications until that person sins. So that when the person dies, where does he go? His record is, he's classified as tzaddik. Because the majority of his actions are positive. But you realize, over the years, what happens? This other person continues to transgress because of the negative influence this first person had on him. So therefore, when a person dies, there's a judgment. There's a verdict based on your record's been evaluated. But there's an ongoing computation, your actions, what ramifications they have in your lifetime, which go beyond the person's lifetime. So a person, let's say, had positive influence on someone. Let's say a person made a Baal Tshuva, which is a phenomenal thing. Phenomenal. But now this Baal Tshuva, he raises generations of observant children and families. There's an ongoing value being generated due to this man's action. So this person, although when he passed away, he was evaluated at one level, there's a continuous upgrade due to all the positiveness which results due to what he had done in his lifetime. So it's continuous, just keeps soaring and soaring. And God forbid if the person was the other way. He had a negative influence on someone. Initially, it was at a very minimal level. But over a lifetime, this other person really created a level of debt which is not to be believed. And why was that debt created? That negative behavior created? Because of this person's negative influence. So therefore, there's a cheshbon, there's a computation which goes beyond the verdict. It's the same thing. So whenever we sin, we never know the ramifications on a personal level, on effective level on other people, and as a result of that, you never know. It's magnified. It can be magnified endless times over, and therefore one has to be responsible for what he does and what he says and how he behaves, not to be that negative role model or influence in somebody else's life for that reason. And one said, when we do a mitzvah, we put on our talis, we put on our tefillin, or any mitzvah. We say, Asher kiddushonu b'mitzvoso v'tzivonu. God has sanctified us with His mitzvahs and commanded us. L'sati tzitzis, to wrap ourselves in the talis, the tzitzis, lo neach tefillin, to wrap the tefillin, al chilas matzati, the matzah, whatever it is. God has commanded us, Asher kiddushonu. He sanctified us, v'tzivonu, and He commanded us. So what does the mitzvah, what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to sanctify us. The mitzvah itself is an act of sanctification. So the more mitzvah a person does, the more sanctified he is. The holier he becomes. Okay? But yet, every Shabbos and every Yom Tif, on the holidays, the festivals, the text of the Amidah is Kachenu mitzvosecha, v'sein chalkeinu mitzvosecha. We ask God, sanctify us with your mitzvahs and give us our portion in the Torah. It's an obvious question. If the text of the blessing before we do a mitzvah is, you've sanctified us with the mitzvah of tefillin, tzitzis, whatever mitzvah you're doing. So what are we asking God? Kachenu mitzvosecha. Sanctify us with your mitzvah and give us a portion of your Torah. It seems to be totally unnecessary because the text of the bracha is, you've sanctified us with your mitzvah when you commanded us to do X, Y, Z. Right? So, but yet every Shabbos and Yom Tif, that's the supplication. So how do we understand it? So we once said, the Rambam says, the Hilchos Tshuva, the laws of Tshuva, that if a person is a sinner, how does God see him? When I say a sinner, I mean a sinner. not a person who's a good person and inadvertently or once in a while he slips. Person is classified as a sinner. So the Rambam says the person who's a sinner who hasn't yet done tshuva, he is seen as an abomination and he's despised by God. And what about when that person does a mitzvah? You know what God does? God says, I don't want your mitzvah. He takes the mitzvah, throws it back at the person. But a person who's classified as a Baal Tshuva, he did tshuva, and he does that same mitzvah, God will embrace the mitzvah. God will value that person and love that person and esteem that person because of his positive position that he did tshuva. But until you do tshuva, because you're abominated and you're despised and detested, your mitzvah God detests. He says he shreds it and throws it back in your face. Now, what's the basis for the sanctification of a person? The source of all sanctification is God. You have a relation with God. When God descended on Sinai, why was the mountain holy? Because God's presence was there. The moment it descended, it was an ordinary piece of rock. What's the basis for us being sanctified when we do a mitzvah? Because that is the connection. That is a link to the source, which is God. So if you do the mitzvah, God embraces the mitzvah, that is the connection. That is the connector. But if God says, I have no interest, and he pushes us away, and he doesn't let it attach to him, there's no sanctification. So the sanctification, our supplication on Shabbos and Yom Tov is, although the mitzvah has innately the ability to bring about that sanctification, but if you're not worthy, it doesn't. So we ask God, although we're far from perfect, allow the mitzvahs that we do, although unworthy, let it create that linkage. And if it creates that linkage, then we are beneficiaries of that relationship, and therefore we become holy. If we become holy, therefore our portion of Torah is going to be an appropriate location. But if it's not appropriate, God's not giving us our portion of Torah. That's the supplication. So we see again, even when we do the mitzvah, if you're not worthy, the mitzvah has no effect on us. No effect. The Kedusha effect. It only has the Kedusha effect based on your level of worthiness. Are you worthy to have the relationship with God, or are you not worthy to have the relationship with God? No. You have two people as qualified as the other. And a person chooses to have a relation with one person, not the other person. And he has good reason to have a relation. And one person doesn't understand. But, I have the same credentials, and it's this and that. Person says, you don't understand. This person, I have a long-standing relationship with this person, with his father, his grandfather, therefore I have a relationship with him. You, I have no relationship, not with your father, not with your grandfather, and you have to prove yourself first before we can have that relationship. If the person's of standing, God says, I will embrace you. If you're not of standing, but I did the mitzvah, God says, I'm not interested. The mitzvah is not what it's all about. It's who you are. If you are that, then your mitzvah is special. And if you're not that person, then your mitzvah doesn't mean anything. It's like a person, he gets himself a Harvard sweatshirt, and the man didn't graduate third grade. And he thinks, and he gets himself, that beret. He looks like, and he gets into a boat on the river up there, and he gets on the rowing team. And and everybody thinks he's a Harvard man. Yeah, he's maybe wearing the sweatshirt, but you understand, and he may row the way the rowing team rows it, but you understand, you're going nowhere. The moment they find out you're not getting through that door, because you have to show your credentials. Who are you? First the question, who are you? Once who you are, then we talk about what the value of your mitzvah is. That's the way it works. There's Rabbeinu Bachio. It's right at the beginning of Leviticus. Torah Kohanim speaks about the sacrifices, how atonement that the certain sins, they can only be atoned if you bring a sacrifice. Now, what is a what is the procedure? You bring the animal and you lean on the animal. It's called smicha. The one who brings the sacrifice has to lean on it. When he leans, it's already consecrated. It's a consecrated animal. It's a species which Torah prescribes for this particular area of atonement. He leans on it, and when he leans on it, he confesses the sin that he's bringing that particular species for atonement. And then the Kohen slaughters it, and he does the ritual, whatever the ritual of the Kohen is. And there's certain korbanos that all sacrifices, the innards are sacrificed on the altar. And there's certain, and let's say it's a sin offering, the only people who are qualified to eat the meat are the male Kohanim. And through the sprinkling of the blood, the sacrificing of the innards, does that achieve atonement? But it has to be predicated. The person has to lean, has to verbal confession, and then it's sacrificed. So Rabbeinu Bachya says something interesting. When a person sins, what it usually happens? Before a person sins, he thinks about it. The thought process is involved. Then usually when he's about to execute it, to cross that line, usually people speak to themselves because he knows he's going to do something which is wrong or about to do anything. Right? A person's about to go to the theater with his wife. It cost him $500 for those tickets. So he has a certain, he's touched by it. So he thinks to himself, yeah, we want to the theater tonight. He doesn't realize he's murmuring it, but there's some level of vocalization on that, and then they go. So he says, when a person sins, first you think about it. You think about, are you not? Then there's some expression, verbal expression, and then you do the action. That's the actual sin itself. So every aspect of the way the person engages in that sin, it has to be atoned. The thought process has to be atoned. The verbal, that you said you were going to sin, you're going to do that sin, has to be corrected. And then the act itself, the action being executed, has to be corrected. So he says, Rabbeinu Bachya, the verbal confession is to correct the speech that was utilized for expression of sin. The leaning on the animal, that corresponds to the action of the sin, the actualization of the sin. So what addresses the thought process? When you burn the innards, and part of the innards are the kidneys of the animal, based on verses, somehow one's renal, the kidneys, have relevance to one's intellect. That's chokhmah. Chokhmah lies in the kidneys. It somehow touches. I'll give you an example. A person who has a heart procedure, we say, love is in the heart. What do you mean love's in the heart? The heart itself is not an organ which has to do with the emotion. It's a muscle which pumps the blood, and that's what a person is able to live. But factually, it is. A person dies of a broken heart. What is a broken heart? What does the heart do when broken? The answer is it touches our emotion. As you know, a person who has a heart transplant or has a serious heart procedure, afterwards, he's very, very emotional. His emotion is very, very fragile. Why? If they do surgery on his arm, on his leg, or some other, he has appendicitis, he's not emotional. But the heart, somehow, he's touched. Because the emotion has to do with the heart. The feelings have to do with the heart. The person has stone-hearted. The verse says, at the end of time, I will take your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. At the end of time when the Mashiach will come. God will give us a new heart, meaning you'll have a heart that has feeling to it. So the kidneys have relevance to chokhmah. So contemplating, considering, plotting to do the sin, so everything needs a correction. The speech needs a correction, the thought needs a correction, and the action has to be corrected. Everything has to be corrected. Nothing, you have to, as they say, you have to clean up. A full cleanup. once mentioned, Moshe Feinstein Zech Tzarech Levracha was a very holy man. Although when you looked at him, it's not that he stood the Amidah for 3 hours, but he was a Torah sage of exceptional level. And I remember as a little boy, when I used to see him walking in the street on the Lower East Side, he would walk in those days by himself. He would always, his lips were always moving. When he walked in the street, he'd be looking down at the sidewalk, and his lips were always moving. He knew Shas, he knew the Talmud by heart, he had it on his fingertips. And he'd always be reviewing the Torah itself. That's what he was. In today's Daf Yomi, it says, Ashrei mi shebo lekad the Talmud biyado. Fortunate is the person after 120 years, he arrives and he has the Talmud in his hand. It's in his hand. They say, by the way, what do you know? And you say, this is what I know. And you present the whole Talmud. And they give you an exam. How well do you know it? He knew it. By the time he passed away, he reviewed it over 400 times. He knew it backwards and forwards, instantaneous recall. That's what he was. So he once gave a ruling, and you know, Hasidic rabbis, they're known for to be wonder rabbis. But a Lithuanian Torah sage, he's not known. But they have endless stories that whoever he gave a blessing to, the blessing always was fulfilled. Or Moshe Rabbi Feinstein. So he once gave a ruling, and there was tremendous reaction to the ruling because it was a tremendous leniency. And somebody had written him a letter which was considered disrespectful. And he said to Rabbi Feinstein, how do you give such a ruling? And how do you even have the audacity to take on your shoulders and to give such a ruling? Don't you realize you're not who you think you are? And the term is, you're not a Das Torah. You're not a Torah authority. Because if you give that kind of ruling, clear you're not a Torah authority. So Moshe Feinstein never ever displayed any strong position in terms of who he was. In terms of his rulings, he never retracted a ruling, ever. He ruled tens of thousands of responsa, never ever retracted. But in terms of here, it was a personal attack, he wouldn't have said anything. But here, where they're attacking him as a person because he's not qualified to give the ruling, now he's standing up for the veracity of his ruling, and he says, "I want to tell you something. You don't even know what a Torah mind is. In my life, a secular thought never passed through my mind. In my life, and he already was a man in his upper 70s. My life, a secular thought never passed through my mind. My mind all my life has only been fully occupied in Torah thought. Nothing but that. And you're telling me what a Torah mind is, what a Torah mind is not?" That's what he writes back. And therefore my ruling is founded and rooted on who I am, which is my Torah knowledge, and therefore I will not retract from that position. That's what he writes. So what's Kedusha? What's holiness? You know what that means? A person's whole life, he's a holy man. Because every aspect of his life was fully invested and committed in that. Therefore, you connected that, your blessing has value. Your words have value. Your thought has value. And God embraces that person. Because that's the person God embraces. That person is an adjunct. He's an adjunct of God. And that's the person you want to be associated with. We say in the third paragraph of the Shema, which we discussed, the mitzvah of tzitzis, Uri'isimoso, uzchartem. You will look at the tzitzis, uzchartem es kol mitzvos Hashem Elokechem. When you look at them, you will remember the mitzvos of Hashem. What does that mean? But speaking about, a person can have instant recall. If you ask him, he'll immediately respond to your question. But the question is, what is his mind? You know, they say out of sight, out of mind. That's what we say. Something that's in the forefront of your mind, you're touched by it. Something's out of sight, it's out of mind. although when you ask the person, it immediately comes to mind, but otherwise he's not touched. What the Torah says, there's something innate in tzitzis that when you look at them, and you're supposed to look at your tzitzis, when you say that in the third paragraph of the Shema, you're supposed to look at the tzitzis, Risa muschartem. There's something innate that when you see them, you will be touched by the mitzvahs. Okay? So the Chafetz Chaim writes that if a person ever feels temptation for something, why all of a sudden do you feel that you're vulnerable to that sin? If you'd be studying the law at that moment and you relate to its value, that you'll be less touched by temptation. It's only because something, it's on the back burner. It's not in your emotion. It's not in your mind. When you look at the tzitzis, there's something innate in that. It brings it to the forefront of your mind. It's not recollection. It touches you. And when you're touched by the mitzvah, that will cause you to be protected not to sin. That will take, as they say, the wind out of the sails. That's what it'll do. But the Chafetz Chaim says, you can only remember what you studied at one time. If you studied it, you look at the tzitzis, it will activate the value of what you originally studied. But what happens if you never studied it? You could look at the tzitzis from today forever if you're remembering nothing. So therefore, he says, it's important always to study. And to study all the mitzvahs. And it's interesting, there was a work published by the Chafetz Chaim, and it was translated by Feldheim Publishers many years ago. It's a compendium of the Torah mitzvahs, which the Chafetz Chaim had authored, which a person in a short period of time, it's a small book, that you can review all 613 positive and negative commandments with a little bit of elucidation. And if you're well versed in that, when you look at your tzitzis, you remember the mitzvah. Otherwise you don't. It's been translated into English. Feldman put it out many years ago. It's worthwhile to get. I'm sure it's still in print, or you could definitely download it, or to get it somehow, it's still in circulation somewhere. But that's the value.
Rabbi, what's the name of the book?
It's a compendium on the mitzvahs. I'm not sure what it was called. It's called Kitzur Torah Mitzvahs. It's an abbreviated 613 precepts of the Torah. It's a compilation on abbreviated level. That's what it is. Okay, I think we'll stop here today, and we'll continue later with the Daf Yomi at 11, and tomorrow at 9 o'clock we have the Chafetz, from 12 to 12:30 we have the Chafetz Chaim tomorrow. And 10 to 6 tomorrow morning, we're back in the saddles, as they say. Alan, be well. Good to see you. Everybody have a good week. Shua Tov, a good Foch. Be well. Take care.
See you at 11.
See you at 11 o'clock. Be well.